Reform and Philosophy of Education, taking a closer look at the regime redefining education, knowledge, and human beings by Professor Mina. She is a professor of education at University of Lund, Sweden, followed by Professor Claudia Schumann's Cosmopolitanism as a Critique of Reification. She teaches at the Catholic University Eichstätt, Germany. And this session be chaired by Rohit Dhankar, who teaches at Azim Premji University. May I have you all?
Very, very pleased to be here today and to meet all of you, even just at this distance. It's a delight to be here in your beautiful country and have this opportunity to speak about something that I feel very deeply about. I think it's important, after this long presentation of professors in the philosophy of education, to mark my position. I'm a professor in international and comparative education, which is a broad field. But within this field, there is a large interest in the philosophy of education as well. And I think it might be interesting to show the somewhat dissimilar positioning and questions that we engage in comparative education in relation to the philosophy of education. Okay, I must explain that I'm terribly nervous, but because there are so many of you, and I feel very conspicuous standing up here, talking about things which I'm sure that you know more about than I do. But at any rate, I'm going to try to convince myself that this is fun, and I'm going to enjoy it. So I'm working very, very hard on my own perception of what is fun and not fun, and I hope that towards the end of my presentation, we can at least agree that it hasn't been painful. Okay. The main thrust of this paper is to describe human capital theory and its impact on education, questioning its relevance, appropriateness, or acceptability. International organizations have increasingly grown in importance and power, not least as regards their influence on education. Included in this term are such organizations as the OECD, the UNESCO, the World Trade Organization, the European Union, the European Commission, and its many, many, many directories, and the World Bank. In this paper, it is argued that IOs, international organizations, are social institutions governing the actions of those involved in specifiable activities or sets of activities, and can therefore be considered regimes. Regimes are sets of implicit or explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given area of international relations. It is generally acknowledged that a regime entails some principles, norms, and rules, and these form the intrinsic features of a regime, while the conventions and decision-making procedures would be subsidiary features that could change without affecting the essence of these organizations or institutions. So the argument is the following. Given that the above organizations, through funding, programs, and policy, influence national and global policy and practices, it is argued here that they indirectly exert influence on international relations. We also argue that these international organizations can be viewed as one regime that strives to govern the actions of those involved in specifiable activities or set of activities. Now, I'll take a breather. If, for the sake of argument, we even maintain that these international organizations function together and in collaboration and cooperation with one another, which seems to be a fair assumption, We can even stretch ourselves to maintain that taken together, these supernatural national regimes constitute one powerful regime with similar goals and expectations, especially as regards education, which is the topic of our concern. If we accept this assumption, we can go on to identify the common goals as regards education that characterize this one regime. The common denominator for the regime is the use of human capital theory. Today, such phrases as the knowledge society, the knowledge economy, and the learning economy have become so commonplace that little attention is given to their origin or to their meaning. These phenomena are constructions and are part of a very thick discourse, a discourse that is characterized by a common theoretical starting point, an economic perspective on human development. Underlying this discourse is the use of the same theoretical perspective, and that is of human capital theory. In the following, I will present a very, very short history of human capital theory, and then I will go on to discuss the implications of human capital theory and try to discuss them from a philosophical perspective. It would probably be appropriate now to ask how many of you are familiar with human capital theory? Ah, good. So you'll help me out towards the end, I hope, with questions. Theodore Schultz's presidential address to the American Economic Association on December 28th, 1960, on the theme of investment in human capital is one of the first systemic articulations of human capital theory. Sobel refers to this occasion as the inauguration of the human investment revolution in economic thought. As with modernization theory, human capital theory provided a basic justification for large public expenditures on education, both in developed and developing countries. Essentially, there are two key features of the theory. The first is the assumption that there is a causal relationship between education and development, i.e., that wage differentials or income distribution can be causally connected to education. Schultz himself described human capital theory in the following terms. I propose to treat education as an investment in man, underline man, and to treat its consequences as a form of capital. Since education becomes part of the person receiving it, I shall refer to it as human capital. The second feature of human capital theory was advanced by Schultz and expanded on by Becker, and that is that even if education is an individual investment, the cumulative effect of individual investments in education will directly affect the national economy. Baptista goes on to say that there are three pillars for human capital theory: maximizing behavior, market equilibrium, and stable preference. In short, they are: human beings only engage in behaviors from which they can derive the maximum benefit. 2, the only recognized regulatory system is that of a free and competitive market. 3, people's desires do not substantially change over time, nor are they very different between wealthy or poor persons, or even between persons in different societies or cultures. Anyone upset yet? This usually gets me so upset that I go out and smoke a cigarette, but I quit smoking, so that I can't do that now. We'll go on. There has been substantial critique of human capital theory, and one of the main criticisms is the causal relationship between education and development that has been the main postulate. And it's been accepted by academics and policymakers in the late 50s and the early 60s. It was supported by publications and funding programs of the OECD and UNESCO, and education came to be viewed almost without question as an important and even crucial agent for the rapid economic growth of nations. The degree of theoretical conviction was so high, while the level of empirical evidence was so scant, that the belief in the benefits of education have been called one of the most romantic tales of the century. Notwithstanding this critique, human capital theory maintains a strong theoretical hold on education. However, human capital theory has changed over the years since its introduction in the 60s. Its expansion has been encouraged by the OECD and also the World Bank, which not only supported the inclusion of technology, but also incorporated elements of screening theory in human capital theory. Unlike its earlier framers, the OECD contended that education and training perform important screening functions that are likely to positively affect worker productivity, regardless of whether or not the training provides specific job-related skills. The key, according to the OECD, appears to be the ability of workers to cope with technological changes and to turn them into advantages in the future. The OECD believed that education, through its screening function, streamlines the available pool of flexible and adaptable workers and consequently enhances the efficiency of both recruitment and production processes. And these words are their own. Today, human capital theory, after a brief period of less legitimacy, has returned. Baptista summarizes the version of human capital theory that is in use today in the following manner. The contemporary version of human capital theory differs from its predecessors in three important respects. It incorporates technology as a factor that mediates the relationship between human capital and productivity. It integrates elements of the screening hypothesis, and it advocates private over public investments in education. Not only does human capital theory continue to prescribe the agenda for education and education reform, it does so through the particular way of seeing education that it represents. And this, for me, is a very important life, so I'll give you time to read what it says there. The theory positions actors in a particular way, understanding themselves and acting on themselves and others as human capital. This is central to neoliberal governmentality and the notion of the self as enterprise. So the logical question I pose now as a heading, if the theory is so poor, why is it so popular? There are a number of reasons for its popularity. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it legitimized increased expenditures on education, and this became a very important reason for promoting this theory. It also provides politicians with a pretext for action. Strategies like lifelong learning, supported by international organizations and national governments, are based theoretically on human capital theory, and they deflect attention from the need for economic and social reform. They divert attention away from the more fundamental causes of low productivity, and they convert deep-seated economic problem into short-lived educational projects. Human capital theory is incapable of taking polarization into account. Indeed, performance indicators function to increase polarization, constructing educational apartheid in cities in Britain and creating a sharp divide between valuable and non-valuable people and locales. As a result, what we are left with is a fundamental split in societies all over the world. On the one hand, active, culturally self-defined elites, of which the majority are here. On the other hand, increasingly uncertain, insecure social groups deprived of information, resources, and power, digging their trenches of resistance. Human capital theory also offers the comforting illusion that for every complex problem, there is one single solution. To many politicians and policymakers, the seductive appeal of this approach at a time of economic uncertainty offers the illusion of control and managerial solutions. So I lied before. I said that that was my most important point. Here comes some more most important points. The key point, however, is that human capital theory diminishes the concept of the human, and it diminishes the concept of education. Over and above redefinition of education in terms of instrumentality and performativity, human capital theory focuses on the human as an individual unit, which is essential in economic theory. Whether or not it's relevant within the philosophy of education or international education, it's clear that this is not an acceptable way of viewing human beings. And education is viewed solely as a matter of individual choices. Social and structural inequality and discrimination based on race, religion, or gender is ignored in human capital theory, which attributes lack of success or accomplishment to individual shortcomings. We'll underline that one more time. In the United States, where I grew up, they used to use the expression, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And I think you can summarize human capital with that expression as well. If you are not successful, it's because of your own individual shortcomings. Has nothing to do with society or whether or not society functions, or it prohibits you to develop and does not provide you with the opportunities to gain another position, to have education, to advance in the system. If we accept that human capital theory can and does promote economic growth, which is a contentious assumption because there is no clear empirical evidence that this is the case, the question remains, what is economic growth good for? The theory essentially makes an abrupt stop at this point, as if economic growth were an end in itself. It is this gap that means that issues around education and values re-emerge as crucial, even if economic growth is accepted as a good. It remains to be argued, what is it good for? Okay, I'm going to drink some water. The philosophical perspective, I would maintain, in relation to that which I have previously spoken of can be summarized in the following points. The goal of education is personal, social, and cultural transformation. Understanding oneself and one's position in the world and in relation to others is one of the main tasks of education, as is instilling an understanding of the infinite process of struggle, which can not only transform education, but educate all of us about the great things that can happen when you fight for what is right and look at the world through a third set of eyes. This position, I acknowledge, comes from Michael Apple in the United States, and I think that you can call him perhaps a radical or progressive educator. He goes on to say that the only legitimacy for education is that legitimacy has a utopian view. It gives us the opportunity to think about a better life, a better society, better conditions for ourselves and our children. The utopian, it doesn't promise a utopian society, but education should instill in us the hope that through our efforts we can change society. And this utopian vision of education is in contrast to the view of education as a cognitive, technical process through which factual content is transmitted. And it is posed on the basis of the emancipatory power of education. The emancipatory power of education is to provide, to instill hope where there is none, to provide understanding in the face of ignorance, to provide the tools for living with others and envisioning a better world for us all. In my paper, I've gone into an extensive criticism of the following definition of knowledge. And those of you who are interested in philosophy, you can go home now because the European Union has already defined knowledge. So forget Socrates and Plato. Throw them all away because the European Union has made a definition, and this is the most important definition of knowledge, according to the European Union. It is the outcome of the assimilation of information through learning. It is related to the body of facts, principles, theories, and practices that are related to a field of work or study. That was easy, wasn't it? In my paper, I have gone into a lot of detail about the use of the word assimilation. And I've also taken the word and contrasted it to Piaget's theory of learning. Accommodation and assimilation. In the paper, I note that assimilation is the easiest form of learning. It is the form that means that you are presented with facts, and the facts that you are presented with, or the knowledge you're presented with, fits perfectly into your conceptual framework. Similar to osmosis, you just soak it up, okay? But assimilation is also considered the source of shallow learning, not deep learning. And I maintain that the purpose of education is not shallow learning, but rather deep learning. And there's a very interesting discussion about the difference between the two. Recently, there was a project done in the United States with 2 American teachers who in 17 different states did an enormous study as to what kind of learning pupils were doing in the classroom. In all 17 states, teachers were teaching at the shallow learning level. They were teaching for tests. And of course, the students were learning for tests. And I would maintain that this has to do with the whole perception of what the purpose of education is. Is the purpose of education to take a test in order to get a grade, in order to advance in the system, the outcomes of which are what? Degrees and grades. And I would maintain that this is not how I see education and its purpose. And it's somewhat disturbing, I think, that we have in so many states in the United States students who are learning at that level only for tests. Because shallow learning means that you learn only at that level that is appropriate for where you learned it. It cannot be used in another context. It's only appropriate for the context in which you learned it. And then you can instantly forget it. It's not applicable. It's not useful. It's not knowledge. Okay. I would maintain that the definition that the European Union uses for knowledge sharply contrasts to the definition of Bildung, and I thank my colleague who went into great detail this morning, so I don't have to go into detail. I'm going to make it easy on myself and give you a very concise definition of Bildung. Bildung is one of those German words for which there is no English translation. It means not just education, but cultivation, with the connotation of appropriating the culture of one's time so as to become a self-determining individual, sharing in responsibility for the maintenance of the culture of the community. To acquire Bildung means to be free, not so much by making choices, but by knowing what one must do by acts of self-determination. And these two stand in stark contrast to one another as philosophies, as understanding of, as the purpose of education. Now, how many minutes do I have left?
About 10.
Okay, thank you. One more glass of water. I attribute this to my nervousness, but I'm doing all right, okay? Am I? Yes. Okay. You have survived thus far. Right, okay.
You are not very and I can see that everyone is awake.
Are they awake? Good. That was very nice of you. I appreciate it. Okay. So one important question remains. What is the human? And I'm not really sure in the remaining 10 minutes that I can comprehensively discuss what the human is, but I can give a short proposal. I propose herein that the human is closely linked to this concept of Bildung, the one that we discussed previously. The human is a social being who assumes responsibility for the maintenance of the culture of the community in which she or he lives, whatever that may be. It is suggested here that the human is a social cultural construction that is not universal. I'm sorry about that, but highly dependent on the context in which it exists. As the human is dynamic and in a constant state of change, education of the human must take this into consideration. Universal recipes, standards, and measurements that disregard the contextual nature of the human are not considered relevant, appropriate, or acceptable, but rather impoverishing. Assuming, as human capital theory does, that human preferences do not change over a lifetime, but remain constant and stable, is a misrepresentation of the human and the purpose of education. Human capital theory views people as individual units solely intent on maximizing their own benefit, disregarding social cultural differences and the effects of social and cultural inequality and discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or gender. It allots the free and unregulated market a god-like stature in the concerted effort to increase economic growth, for which the purpose remains unclear. Stanish protests against this view and maintains that education can and should not be restricted to that which can be given expression, measured, standardized, and quantified. Rather, he maintains that what is taught should not be conceived in terms of banks of knowledge or transferable skills or how do you pronounce that? Thank you very much. Of whatever kind. You know, sometimes you run out of steam. I'm running out of steam now. Okay. I thought, given the context in which I am today, I would end with the following quotation. Good. Are you familiar with Krishnamurti? He said, he wrote in 1953, education is not merely acquiring knowledge, gathering and correlating facts. It is to see the significance of life as a whole. But whole cannot be approached through the part, which is what governments, organized religions, and authoritarian parties are attempting to do. This is 1953. The function of education is to create human beings who are integrated and therefore intelligent. Intelligence is a capacity to perceive the essential, the what is, and to awaken this capacity in oneself and in others. This is education. Thank you.
You are right in time, and we have about 35 minutes for questions now. I think she had said many things which perhaps will raise lots of questions. One, and then Navneet, and then Bihar Shah, three.
Nervousness, you did manage to keep us awake, and that too after lunch. So that is an achievement in itself. And second thing, ma'am, you said about shallow learners, and it is because shallow learners are there since we want them to reproduce what do we deliver them. So do you suggest we should focus on turning or using autodidactism as a method so that they can seek and explore resources or seek the correct method to investigate and explore new knowledge rather than cramming the old whatever is written in the books and reproducing it. So in that manner maybe we'll be able to produce deep learners. Thank you.
That was a big one, wasn't it? Okay, you're really putting me in somewhat of a tight position because I'm not really convinced that there is one universal method for teaching or there is a more appropriate way of promoting learning among children. I firmly believe that education is interaction, first of all, and that it, whether or not children or doctoral students or university students learn depends upon the effort of both the teacher and the student to meet somewhere in a space where an interaction is created. And I think the most essential characteristic for any kind of learning environment is engagement and understanding. My father wanted me to become a teacher, And I am one of 4 children. My brothers were all told to be lawyers, and they did as Daddy said. And then Daddy tried to tell me to be a teacher, and I said, no way, Dad. Because teacher's education, where I lived in Arizona, was a do-it thing. It had nothing to do with the philosophy of education. It had to do with practical, education was doing things, right? And for me, it was not something that I wanted to do. So wherever he is today, he's probably laughing because I am, anyway, a teacher. I think essentially what I'm trying to say, that individual teachers and individual groups of students, they contribute to the educational environment and the optimal learning space. And whatever strategies that you have learned as a teacher, they have to be adopted from the individual preconditions of the people for whom you wish to create learning opportunities. So that I'm afraid I can't say that as long as, I don't believe that there are universal, the best methods or best practices or most efficient this and that. I think it has to do with many, many other factors: engagement, interest, empathy, understanding, and of course, the time to cultivate a learning environment. Because it doesn't just happen, it has to be cultivated and nurtured. Is that an answer?
Thank you, Navrit.
I'll be asking a question of more of again a chicken type of question.
A chicken type of question. This is nearly a whole farm. Since I came to India, people hear my name and say, oh, fish. So you're a chicken, I'm a fish.
That's quite an analogy. Anyway, the theory of performativity which you talked about, you gave a reference to the idea of performativity and instrumentality. Probably Lyotard has also worked upon the same notion. So I'm just trying to think in a context whether it was the performance criterion of the individual which somehow seeped in through the education and compelled these international organizations to believe that humans can be capital, or it was the other way around, that these international organizations thought that nation states need to perform, and so it had an implication for the citizens to become a performing citizen.
That one. I am very, very radical, I guess, because I really don't understand how one can defend the idea that you teach children for 5 weeks and then you give them an exam. And on the exam, they are supposed to regurgitate what they have learned during those 5 weeks. And then they go on to another 5 weeks. I like to tell the story of Winston Churchill. You know who he was? Apparently, he didn't go to school. He had a governess who taught him. And at one point in his life, the governess wrote a letter to his parents saying that he is completely impossible. And I think that he might even be mentally retarded. And the point I'm trying to make is that the structure in education is based on a lot of preconceptions that belong to behavioral science. That we have certain stages in which children develop, very neat package. Your child should be potty trained by the time they're 3, blah, 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 etc. And schooling has the same kind of schematic behavioral perception about learning. I would even maintain that there are people who first learn how to do math when they become teachers. I was miserable in math. But when I had to teach math, then I understood it 25 years later. So I would maintain that the educational system as it's structured today is built upon a whole bunch of misconceptions. The first being, that which you teach is what students learn. There are a whole bunch of misconceptions about education, and unfortunately, the educational system is structured on these misconceptions. Because the system itself is a system of evaluation and monitoring. But my question is, what do we need the system for? We need the system to get degrees. We need the system to prove that the system is functioning. But are we really proving that pupils are learning? And that, I mean, is the core question. Is the educational system, both that which we have in our nations and that which the international organizations wish that we should implement, is it a system that is really promoting learning? Or is it promoting grades and degrees and legitimizing the system itself? Well, the whole idea of learning, deep learning, is not even in the equation. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, Bihar Sahib.
Okay. Let me first congratulate you. It's really an excellent presentation.
Thank you. We do this in Sweden. We do that when we thank people.
I believe that you have echoed the feelings of lots of the people here. In any case, you have been able to, as Rohit said, you have been able to make everybody remain awake. Okay, there's one question, but there are a few other things. There may be questions, there may be only reflection from what you have presented. The question is, while I largely agree with what you have said, I found something very disconcerting. Is when you, can you please show me just the previous one, just the previous one. Yeah. When you talk about individual being a socio-cultural being, all right, but then you say for maintenance of the culture. The word maintenance, yeah.
Is it here?
Yeah. You are talking.
Oh, that's, yes, but that is a direct quotation. If I was saying, I wouldn't use the word of maintenance of culture, because culture, if it's maintained, will die. It is constantly changing and evolving.
Maybe it
Yeah.
will be useful if you can.
So, anyway, I am trying to say it's not just for maintenance, I am saying also for change.
Exactly.
You see, when you talk about liberating education, when you talk about emancipatory education, then you are not expecting only to be a socio-cultural unit to maintain or be part of the culture, but also to question the culture and change the culture. So I think that's the only part where I thought I'll put it, either you will be able to explain it, or maybe it's a kind of a disagreement.
No, I agree with you completely. Thank you very much for your comment.
Okay, now two more things which are by and large reflection, but there may also be questions. Ultimately the lesson that I learned from this and from many others earlier is that you cannot look at philosophy of education in itself. It is embedded in large number of global processes. You cannot look at philosophy of education and understanding of education without looking at the political economy, without looking at the political and dominant political and economic philosophy of today. They are interrelated. The next point that I draw from here is, and that I think is quite important to understand, that there is a kind of a hegemonic relationship the modern education system, in fact, fortunately the question already came in that. In John White's paper, I recollect John White's paper, while he was emphasizing only the disciplines and the subjects. Let us look at the origin of the modern education system, which has now become the global education system. And link it with the spread of colonies. You see, it's ultimately one way of having hegemony over the world, ruling over the world, and that is through education, and therefore the modern education system everywhere. Everywhere you have the same system which you have been critiquing. And therefore there is another problem, the limitation of knowledge. There is a called Indian philosophy of education, right? Education has been here, and there is an understanding of education in India. There is an understanding of education in China. But when we discuss philosophy of education, they are not our universe. You know, there is a hegemony of relationship also in the knowledge systems. And finally, the liberalism and the neoliberalism, capitalism and neo-capitalism. Philosophy of education unwittingly, unless it is careful, and the whole education system is serving the purpose of or getting converted into the tool of this. It's not just the international organizations that were our starting point, but there are other also non-international organizations, powers, important powers in the world who are linked, and therefore the whole system of education is not just education, it's not just human education, even the kind of concept you are talking about, but it's more a question of ultimately reordering the world in a certain manner to the advantage of some people, some regions.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded of someone asked me earlier, who do you like? And who do I like? As a theoretical thinker, I'm very, very, very enamored of Bruno Latour's work. And he says that we all commit one enormous fault. And when we have done our project and we have our findings, we try to explain them by using the social or society. He said, this sociologists do all the time, and we all do that. These things happen because of society. He says, you can't explain society with society. So he's written a book that's called Reassembling the Social. And I think that this is an interesting extension of what you are saying. He says that if you want to understand society or the social, you start looking at the actors. And then you look at the people they act on, the actants. And then you look at the different networks of actors. Then you get a better understanding of what the social is. And this is a particular network, an actor network, in which the actors are the international organizations and the actants are all of us. And there are other, as you have said, other networks. The problem is that these are not democratic organizations. We can't influence them. International organizations, according to their statutes, have no responsibility. The legal structure of international organizations is that they are not liable by law to take responsibility for any of their actions, suggestions, reforms. So we're in a position with a powerful network that has no responsibility for its actions, that is acting globally, and it is powerful and non-democratic. And that, I think, is a real problem. Yes.
Interesting. I think you kept most of us awake because you frightened us. The regime you spoke of is a very overwhelming issue, and I think something that we need to take note of. In countries like India and other developing countries, it's not just these, but I think there is a conglomeration of many of these organizations that come through funding of, say, rural development programs, which are also tied to a very specific way of education, or whatever they call as education. So in India, we have the World Bank, for instance, funding the whole education program in India, and with that comes the Right to Education Act, which talks about universalized education, which very specifically what it wants. And in the last few years, we also have this tremendous change where privatization has also come into play in India. Now the corporates moving into the education sector, it seems as though what the state wants, what the corporates wants, what the Constitution of India wants are all the same. And many people are sort of given to believe that. This morning we heard Mr. Anurag also talking about an equitable, humane society that we want out of a corporate program also. Is that possible? Would the corporates sort of try to dig their own graves in the long run? This is a question that really troubles me.
I don't know. I don't have enough expertise, but I would like to refer to the point I was making previously. This is one network, international organizations. There's another network called, a colleague of mine in Norway, he calls it Dostango. It is that you put donor, state, and NGO together. And he says this is a system. And anyone who believes that NGOs have moral supremacy over the state or donors is fooling themselves. It's one system with people rotating around in the system. And I think it would be interesting to start looking at the systems. Who are the actors? Who are the networks? Who are the actants? And what is the purpose? And where is the power? Because ultimately it is a democratic problem when we are powerless when faced with large networks that have a moral supremacy or another agenda or a hidden agenda, and we don't have the power or legitimacy to protest or to correct or to say no. So I would maintain that perhaps looking at the network of international organizations, there are lots of people who've done work on Nestlé. For example, you have Nestlé here. It has had a lot of scandals over the years. There are a lot of international corporations here. Presently, you're going to have IKEA, and that's a really, really rotten organization. So, I mean, there are lots of things that you should look at. IKEA, for example, hasn't paid any taxes in Sweden for the last 30 years.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question. Yeah, last question.
I think I have just one comment on the way you defined being human. And, you know, when I accepted that being a human being is a socio-cultural construct, then it becomes easier for me to understand why HCT is popular. Because if it is a construct, then people in power can construct the way they want it. Okay? So it's easier to, you know, tell people that, you know, human being is a human capital. And it's not only these bigger organizations who are, you know,
say, sponsoring this idea, but lay people, common people are also, they see education as investment, as a way out from economic deprivation or misery, whatever, they're facing. So what I'm trying to say here is that if we leave that universal thing out, then HCT is what we will have, or we may have even worse theories, driving our lives. So I do feel that each individual, is socially, culturally constructed, either individually or through the society as a whole. But at the same time, there has to be something universal which will give us the ground for connecting to each other, the ground for finding the basis for equity or justice. Otherwise, if each one or every other society, has individuals who are socially constructed, then, then there is a problem with, having something universal or some ground for universal connectedness or so there is, I think we need to maybe deliberate more on what does it mean to be human, because the whole education is about human beings, and if our understanding about it hasn't grown beyond, human being seen as social animals or a social construct, I think it has to go beyond that, and that is a good philosophical, inquiry to actually get into. Thank you.
Thank you. The search for universal laws, universal norms, universal values, etc. This has been going on for a very long time. Sometimes it peaks, sometimes it recedes in popularity. I know that in law, there is an increasing interest in conceptualizing human beings from the perspective of the law. And there's a very, very heated debate in critical legal studies, which is quite interesting and which I could suggest that you take part in.
Could you please be brief?
I can't resolve that question now, but I will take it into consideration, and I thank you for your comment. Was that brief enough?
Yeah, that's
Good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now we have second speaker, Claudia.